February 8th, 1855. The people of Devon, England, awoke to a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A heavy snow had fallen during the night, blanketing the countryside in pristine white. But something had walked through that snow. Something impossible. The first person to notice was a baker in the small village of Topsham, just after dawn. He stepped outside his shop and stopped dead in his tracks. There, in the fresh snow, was a trail of footprints. But these were like no footprints he had ever seen. Each print was roughly 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. They were shaped like a horseshoe or a cloven hoof. The baker followed the trail with his eyes. It led down the main street, perfectly spaced, 8 inches apart, one print directly in front of the other. As if whatever made them had walked on 2 legs. But it was what happened next that turned his blood to ice. The prints didn't just follow the road. They went up the side of a building. The baker stood there, breath misting in the frozen air, staring at the impossible trail ascending the vertical wall of the house across the street. Within the hour, the entire village was outside, following the trail. The prints continued over rooftops, across gardens, through narrow alleyways barely wide enough for a cat. They crossed the Exe River. But here's what made everyone's skin crawl. The prints didn't stop at the water's edge. They continued on the other side, as if whatever made them had walked across the river, or simply appeared on the opposite bank. A local reverend named Reverend Musgrave organized a group to map the trail. What they discovered sent shockwaves through every town and village in South Devon. The prints didn't just appear in Topsham. They were everywhere. Reports came flooding in from over 30 locations. Towns and villages separated by miles, all reporting the same mysterious prints. In Exmouth, Dawlish, Teignmouth, Totnes. Even the isolated village of Woodbury reported them. When cartographers later plotted all the sightings, they estimated the trail covered over 100 miles in a single night. But it wasn't just the distance that defied explanation. It was where the prints went. In the town of Dawlish, the trail led directly to a 14-foot-high wall. The prints went straight up one side and continued down the other, with no disturbance in the snow on top of the wall. In another location, the prints approached a haystack. They didn't go around it. They went through it, emerging on the opposite side in perfect alignment. A farmer in Limpstone discovered the prints had passed through a 6-inch diameter drain pipe running under his property. He got down on his hands and knees and peered into the pipe. There, in the frozen mud inside, were the prints, continuing through a space no animal could possibly navigate. Stables were found with the prints inside, though every door and window had been locked and bolted the night before. Horses were found in states of absolute terror, eyes rolling, frothing at their mouths. Dogs refused to follow the trail. When dragged near the prints, they would whimper, pull back, their hackles raised in primal fear, the newspapers picked up the story within days. The Illustrated London News published detailed drawings of the prints. The Times of London devoted entire columns to eyewitness accounts. One witness, a schoolteacher named Margaret Westlake, wrote in her diary, "The prints came to my garden gate, proceeded up the path, and then climbed the wall of my cottage. I traced them across my roof. They descended on the far side and continued toward the church. I have never known such dread." At the Powderham Castle estate, the groundskeeper reported finding the prints in the deer park. The deer had gathered in a terrified huddle in the far corner, as far from the trail as possible. The prints had approached to within feet of them, then turned away, as if whatever made them had been hunting and chose not to strike. Churches across Devon filled to capacity that Sunday. Reverend Musgrave delivered a sermon about the marks, calling them a visitation, a warning. But a warning of what? Theories spread like wildfire through the terrified communities. Some said it was the devil himself, walking the earth, marking the souls he would soon claim. Others believed it was a demon, or perhaps multiple demons, moving simultaneously across the countryside. The more rational minds proposed animals. Perhaps a badger, or an otter, or even a kangaroo escaped from a private zoo. But none of these explanations held up to scrutiny. A badger's prints looked nothing like hooves. An otter couldn't climb vertical walls. And a kangaroo? The prints showed no sign of hopping, just a steady, methodical, two-legged gait. Besides, what kangaroo could travel 100 miles in a single night, through snow, over buildings, across rivers? A naturalist named Richard Owen examined plaster casts of the prints. He was stumped. The spacing was too regular, too deliberate to be any known animal. And then there was the trajectory. Whatever made these prints never deviated from its path. It went through every obstacle, never around, as if physical barriers meant nothing to it. Armed search parties formed in several villages. Men carried rifles, pitchforks, torches. They followed the trails deep into the woods, into places where the snow lay thick and undisturbed, except for those prints. In the forest near Mamhead, a hunting party reported finding the trail leading to the entrance of a small cave. The prints went inside. They did not come out. 3 men volunteered to enter the cave, torches held high. Inside, they found the prints continuing along the cave floor, then up the wall, then across the ceiling, before disappearing into a crack barely 2 inches wide. One of the men, a blacksmith named Thomas Creed, later told the local newspaper, "It was as if we were following a ghost, something that could slip through stone itself. We left that cave and did not look back." Other search parties reported similar dead ends. Prints leading into sealed buildings, into locked sheds, into spaces too small for any living creature. And in some places the prints simply stopped, mid-stride, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. As days turned to weeks, more strange details emerged. Several people reported that the prints seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, a phosphorescent quality that made them visible even on moonless nights. A widow in Exmouth swore she heard something on her roof the night the prints appeared. Not footsteps exactly, but a sound like metal scraping on slate. A rhythmic, deliberate scraping. When dawn came, she found the prints crossing her roof in a perfectly straight line. Another witness, a night watchman in Teignmouth, claimed he saw something moving through the snow that night, not walking on the ground, but above it, as if suspended in the air. When questioned further, he became agitated, insisting he'd been drinking and couldn't trust his own eyes. But his logbook from that night told a different story. At 2:47 in the morning, he had written, "Something wrong in the square. Cannot look directly at it. Moving toward church." The entry stopped there. Ink smeared, as if his hand had been shaking. Religious fervor gripped the region. Churches that hadn't seen a full congregation in years were suddenly packed with frightened parishioners. Reverend Musgrave wasn't the only clergy member to address the phenomenon. Across Devon, priests and ministers delivered sermons about divine judgment, about the end of days, about the thin veil between our world and the next. An elderly vicar in Dawlish claimed he had seen references to similar events in ancient texts, events dating back centuries. He spoke of a manuscript from 1205 describing mysterious hoofprints appearing across the countryside of Normandy, France. Prints that climbed walls and crossed water, prints that terrified the population, and before that, stories from medieval Scotland of the devil's tracks, markings that appeared overnight and vanished within days. Were these connected? Was this something that had happened before? And if so, why? The vicar had no answers, only more questions, and a warning. When the devil walks the earth, wise men stay indoors. Scientists from London traveled to Devon to investigate. They brought measuring equipment, cameras, and notebooks filled with hypotheses. One theory suggested the prints were made by experimental balloons, attached to weighted objects that dragged across the snow. But this couldn't explain the prints inside buildings or through narrow pipes. Another scientist proposed a rare atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps electrical discharge creating patterns in the snow. But electrical patterns are random, chaotic. These prints were precise, intentional. A zoologist from the British Museum suggested a mass migration of hopping rodents. This theory was quickly dismissed when locals pointed out that the prints showed no variation, no deviation, as if made by a single entity within human consistency. The most disturbing theory came from a physicist named Dr. Ambrose Carter. He suggested that the prints might not be physical at all, but rather impressions left by something passing between dimensions, briefly touching our reality as it moved through space. His colleagues laughed at him, called him mad, but Dr. Carter stood by his theory. We assume he said, that our world is all there is. But what if it's not? What if something can move between worlds, and these prints are simply echoes? As February wore on, the snow began to melt. The prints disappeared with it, washing away into the mud and earth. But the fear remained. People locked their doors at night. They checked their roofs each morning. Parents kept children inside after dark. And they waited. Waited to see if the prints would return. Weeks passed. Then months. No new prints appeared. By summer, the terror had faded to unease. By autumn, it had become a story told in pubs and parlors. By winter, some were beginning to doubt it had happened at all. But the evidence remained. Plaster casts of the prints were kept in museums. Sketches and diagrams filled scientific journals. Eyewitness accounts, hundreds of them, all describing the same impossible thing. And in a locked drawer in Reverend Musgrave's study, there was something else. Something he told no one about. A journal entry from the night of February 7th, 1855, written hours before the prints were discovered. The entry read, "Tonight the air feels wrong, heavy, as if the world is holding its breath. The dogs will not stop barking. All across the village I hear them, howling into the darkness. I stepped outside an hour ago and felt watched, not by human eyes, by something vast and patient, something that has been waiting. I do not know for what, but I feel with terrible certainty that tonight something crosses over." Reverend Musgrave never showed this entry to anyone. When asked about it years later, shortly before his death, he simply said, "Some things are better left unspoken. I wrote what I felt, and when I woke the next morning and saw those prints, I knew my feeling had been correct. Something did cross over. Whether it crossed back, I cannot say." He died 3 days after making that statement. The journal was found among his possessions, the relevant pages torn out. They were never recovered. Over the following decades, other incidents were reported, though never on the same scale. In 1886, strange prints were found in the snow near the village of Princetown on Dartmoor. Only a few miles of trail this time, but the same distinctive hoof-like shape, the same impossible trajectory over walls and buildings. In 1904, a farmer in Scotland wrote to the Times, describing tracks that appeared overnight on his property, tracks that walked up the side of his barn and across the roof before vanishing. In 1927, a nun in a convent in Wales reported seeing similar prints in the cloister garden after a snowfall. The Mother Superior ordered the snow cleared immediately and forbade anyone from speaking of it. Were these connected to the original Devon prints? Or were they something else entirely? No one could say for certain. But each time the same details emerged. The hoof-like shape, the single-file stride, the impossible paths, and the overwhelming sense of wrongness that accompanied them. Modern researchers have attempted to solve the mystery using contemporary science. Some suggest the prints were made by wood mice or rats, whose small footprints could merge in the snow to create larger, hoof-shaped impressions. But this doesn't explain the perfect spacing or the ability to traverse vertical surfaces. Others propose a hopping hare, or perhaps multiple hares moving in similar patterns across the region. But hares don't hop in single file, and their prints look nothing like hooves. A few investigators have suggested mass hysteria, that people simply wanted to see something supernatural and interpreted normal animal tracks through a lens of fear. But this theory crumbles under the weight of evidence. Too many witnesses, too many locations, too many identical descriptions of prints that defied natural explanation. Meteorologists have examined weather records from February 1855. The night was cold, still, perfect for preserving tracks in snow. Nothing unusual about the weather itself. So if nature didn't create the prints, what did? There's another detail, one that's often overlooked in retellings of the story. A detail that makes the mystery even more disturbing. Several witnesses reported that the prints seemed to be searching for something. In one village, the trail circled a house 3 times before moving on. In another, it approached every door on a street, pausing at each entrance before continuing to the next. At the church in Dawlish, the prints went to every window, as if whatever made them was looking inside, trying to find a way in. A young mother in Exmouth reported waking in the night with the overwhelming sensation of being watched. She went to her child's window and saw nothing, just the dark street and falling snow. In the morning, she found prints directly beneath that window. They had approached the house, stopped at that exact spot, and remained there for some time. The snow around them packed down, as if something had stood there, watching. It knew we were inside, she later told a neighbor. Whatever it was, it knew. Perhaps the most chilling account comes from a doctor named Samuel Westcott. He kept meticulous records of everything he observed on February 8th in 1855. Dr. Westcott traced the prints through his own property, across his garden, up the side of his house, and onto his roof. He climbed up to investigate. On the roof, he found something the others had missed. Or perhaps something they chose not to mention. The prints didn't just cross the roof. They stopped at his bedroom window. And there, in the snow on the roof tiles, he found marks that looked like handprints. Large, with elongated fingers, pressed into the snow on either side of his window, as if something had leaned forward and looked inside while he slept. Dr. Westcott never published this observation. He mentioned it only once in a private letter to a colleague, writing, "I have seen those handprints in my nightmares ever since. They were not human. The proportions were all wrong. Too long, too thin, as if something was wearing the shape of hands, but didn't quite understand how they should look." The devil's footprints became a permanent part of Devon's history. For generations, parents would warn their children, "Stay inside when it snows. You never know what might be walking." Even today, Elderly residents of the affected towns remember the stories their grandparents told. Stories passed down through families like dark heirlooms. In 1950, a journalist interviewed the last living person who had been a child in 1855 and remembered the prints. Mary Ashford was 96 years old. Her memory was sharp. "I was 9, she said. I remember my father wouldn't let us leave the house for 3 days. He stood at the window with his rifle watching. He never said what he was watching for, but I could see the fear in his eyes." Years later, when I was grown, I asked him what he thought made those prints. He looked at me for a long time before answering. Then he said, "Something that should not exist, something that came from a place we're not meant to know about. And the worst part, it's still out there, waiting." Mary Ashford died 2 weeks after that interview. In the archives of the Devon Record Office, there's a box marked simply, 1855 Incident. Inside are hundreds of pages of testimony, sketches, diagrams, correspondence between witnesses and investigators. And at the bottom of the box, sealed in a separate envelope, are photographs taken in 1952. A farmer near Topsham was plowing his field when his equipment hit something solid beneath the soil. He dug it up and found a stone. Not just any stone. A perfectly rectangular slab of granite, buried 6 feet deep, covered in strange symbols. The symbols match no known language. But carved into the center of the stone, clear as day, was an image of a hoofprint. Identical to the prints from 1855. Carbon dating suggested the stone was approximately 800 years old. The farmer reburied it immediately, refused to speak about it publicly, but he told the local historical society and they documented it, and the documentation ended up in that box. 800 years. Had this happened before? Long before 1855? And if so, how many times? There are other stones. A researcher named Dr. Helena Frost spent 20 years investigating medieval records from across Europe. She found references to similar events in France, Germany, Poland, even as far as Russia. In each case, mysterious tracks appeared overnight, tracks that defied explanation, tracks that terrified entire regions. And in each case, within years of the event, someone had erected a stone marker. Dr. Frost published her findings in 1998. Her conclusion was simple and terrifying. These events are not random. They follow a pattern. Every 200 to 300 years, somewhere in the world, these prints appear. They cover vast distances. They follow routes that seem purposeful, and then they vanish. The stones were erected as warnings, memorials, reminders that something walked the earth, something that should not be and might one day return. The academic community dismissed her work, pseudoscience. But Dr. Frost stood by her research. The evidence is there, she insisted. We just don't want to see it. She died in 2003. Natural causes, the death certificate said. but her research notes disappeared from her office the night she died. So what were the devil's footprints? After nearly 170 years, we still don't know. Every rational explanation has been proposed and discarded. Animals. No animal behaves that way. Balloons. Doesn't explain the indoor prints or the passage through solid objects. Mass hallucination. Too many witnesses. Too much physical evidence. Hoax. Impossible to coordinate across 100 miles in a single night with 1855 technology. The prints existed. Hundreds of people saw them, documented them, preserved casts of them. Whatever made them was real. But real doesn't mean natural. Perhaps Dr. Carter was right. Perhaps the prints were echoes, traces of something moving between worlds, something that briefly touched our reality as it passed through. Or perhaps Reverend Musgrave was right. Perhaps something did cross over that night, something ancient and patient, something that has crossed over before and will cross over again. We may never know the truth, but we can be certain of one thing. On the night of February 7th, 1855, something walked across Devon, England. Something impossible. And here's what should keep you awake at night. If Dr. Frost was correct about the pattern, if these events truly occur every 200 to 300 years, the last confirmed sighting was in 1855. That was 170 years ago. We're approaching the window. The time when it might happen again. Somewhere in the world, on some cold winter night, fresh snow will fall. And when the sun rises, someone will look outside and see them. Footprints. Hoofprints. Impossibly spaced. Following impossible paths. And they'll follow the trail with their eyes, up walls, across roofs, through spaces nothing should be able to pass through. And they'll wonder, as the people of Devon wondered. What made these prints? Where did it come from? What was it searching for? And most terrifying of all, did it find it? There's one final detail, something discovered only recently. In 2019, a historian named Michael Saunders was digitizing old newspapers from 1855. He found a small article, just 3 paragraphs, that had never been included in the main historical record. It was published in the Exeter Flying Post on February 15th, 1855, exactly 1 week after the prints were discovered. The article reported that a child had gone missing from the village of Limpstone on the night of February 7th. A girl named Sarah Clemens, 8 years old. She had been put to bed at 8 o'clock. Her parents checked on her at midnight. She was sleeping peacefully. When they went to wake her the next morning, her bed was empty. The window was closed and locked from the inside. The door was closed. There was no sign of forced entry. And outside, beneath her window, were the prints. hoofprints. They approached the house, stopped directly beneath her window, and then continued on their way. Sarah Clemens was never found. Michael Saunders kept digging. He found 2 more cases, brief mentions in parish records, both from villages the prince had passed through. A boy in Dawlish disappeared the same night. An elderly woman in Teignmouth gone from her locked cottage. 3 people vanished on February 8, 1855. All from locations where the prince had been seen. Why wasn't this reported more widely? Why wasn't it connected to the prince? Perhaps because people were too terrified to make the connection. Or perhaps someone deliberately suppressed the information. Saunders published his findings in a historical journal. The article received little attention. But 6 months later, he received a letter. An anonymous letter, postmarked from Devon, containing a single photograph. The photograph showed a gravestone, old, weathered, in a churchyard Saunders didn't recognize. The inscription read, Sarah Clemens, born 1847, returned 1862, may she rest. Returned, not died. Returned. Saunders tried to locate the churchyard. He contacted every church in Devon. None of them had any record of a Sarah Clemens buried in their grounds. The gravestone, if it exists, has never been found. In 2007, something strange happened in the village of Woolsey, North Devon. A snowfall in late February, unusual for that time of year. The next morning, a farmer named David Wickham found tracks in his field. Hoof-like prints, single file, 8 inches apart. He followed them across his property. They went up the side of his barn, across the roof, and disappeared into the woods beyond. David Wickham knew the history. He knew what he was looking at. He called the local police. They documented the prints, took photographs, and filed a report. The report was marked as Unexplained Phenomenon and archived. But here's the thing. David Wickham's farm is less than 15 miles from Topsham, where the original prints were first discovered in 1855. Is it a coincidence? A hoax? Or did something return to Devon after 152 years? And if it returned once, will it return again? The photographs from 2007 are stored in the Devon Police Archives. They're available to the public. Anyone can request to see them. Most people don't, because seeing those prints, even in photographs, even separated by time and distance, creates a feeling. A cold, creeping, primal feeling that something is wrong. What can we conclude from all of this? The Devil's Footprints remain one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. The evidence is undeniable. The prints existed. Hundreds of witnesses saw them. Maps were drawn. Casts were made. Photographs were taken of subsequent appearances. Something created those prints. But what? A creature unknown to science. Something that can manipulate physical space? A visitor from another dimension? Or something even stranger? Something our minds can't fully comprehend? The answer, if there is one, remains hidden. But the prints themselves, the idea of them, continues to haunt us, because they represent something fundamental and terrifying. The possibility that our world, the world we think we know and understand, is not as solid as we believe. That there are cracks in reality, thin places where other things can slip through. And sometimes, on cold winter nights, when the snow falls silent and thick, they do. So the next time snow falls, particularly in February, particularly in southern England, but really anywhere, look outside your window in the morning. Look carefully at the pristine white surface. And if you see prints, hoof-like prints, impossibly spaced, following impossible paths, don't follow them. Or don't investigate. Don't try to understand. Just close your curtains, lock your doors, and pray that whatever made them has already moved on. Because if those prints stop at your window, if they pause outside your door, you'll know what the people of Devon knew in 1855. You'll know what Sarah Clemens knew in her final moments. That something is watching you. Something that should not exist. Something that has come for a reason. And reasons, as we all know, can be terrible things. This has been the story of the Devil's Footprints. A true mystery. An unsolved mystery. And perhaps a mystery that's better left unsolved. This is Regina Sage Monroe, thanking you for listening and wishing you a quiet night. Because some mysteries sleep for years beneath the surface, waiting for someone like you to come along and listen. But before you go, what do you think made those footprints? Let us know in the comments. Or perhaps you have witnessed something similar. If you have, and you dare to share, let us know.